Good morning. This is March 30th, and as you all know, events are moving very swiftly or slowly, depending. And if you allow me, I want to spend the first couple of minutes on something that sounds vaguely academic and say a couple of things about power. So, power is usually divided into two. One is power as in military power, bomb power, whatever the situation calls for. But the other part of power is influence. And power as in arms capacity, economic capacity, and so forth, is different than the capacity to influence, to get other people to do what you want them to do and to respect you for what you're wanting to do. And it is true that you can gain influence through what is called hard power, as in, you can bomb somebody into smithereens or you can threaten them. But it's also possible to generate your positive views towards you or to agree people of your policy by generating influence. Now, politicians tend often, including Trump, tend to conflate these two and to say, well, we're the most powerful country in the world, which might be more or less literally the case, though one can argue there's China and NATO and so forth. And what they mean is a kind of an umbrella term of we can get others to do our bidding, or we can get others to agree to whatever we want to agree. And of course, that could be done through arms, but that could also be done through persuasion or the perceived national interest of other people. So when our president trumps around and says, well, we're the most powerful country in the world, that is no longer literally quite true, in the sense that one could argue that if you divvy up the various components of power, for example, China may have more leverage economically. I could, for example, assert and maybe back it up that at the moment China is more powerful in Latin America than the United States. And by that, I would mean that it has more influence in many ways in Latin America than the United States, even though we see the Monroe Doctrine makes us the most powerful country in Latin America. But what an observer might say is that, well, in Latin America, the economic involvement of China in Latin America in terms of trade and therefore in terms of influence in many ways might actually exceed the American influence, even though Trump and the administration is probably correct that in terms of military capacity of various kinds that could be exercised, we would be more powerful in Latin America, and we would have maybe more of an interest in some aspects of Latin America, which might generate American, quote, hard power. So, for example, in Venezuela and potentially in Cuba. Now, I say all of this by way of prologue to say that it does look in the Middle East, which I wanted to talk a little bit about today, it does look as if the United States, especially the United States, jointly with Israel, can say, we are the dominant power in the Middle East in terms of arms capacity, missile capacity, and so forth. Iran might counter that by saying, well, actually, we have a lot of power. And by that, they also mean drones and missiles. But they might also mean it in terms of influence capacity of one kind or another in some of the Gulf states, in some of the Syria, for example, certainly in Yemen, that has been in the news recently. So this sort of bravado of countries, individually and collectively, saying, we're the most powerful countries in the world, is not, or we are, is not necessarily borne on the ground. Let me give you another illustration. The U.S. is part of NATO. And NATO, as you all know, Article 51 says an attack on one is an attack on all. The Trump administration policy has made that little fuzzy. They're saying, well, maybe yes and maybe no. It is on the record that the first activation ever of NATO, Article 51, when somebody was attacked, was the U.S. in 9/11, where NATO immediately said that they would, get engaged. And of course, it wasn't necessary in the end. Don't want to bore you with the historical details here. But Article 51 has led Europeans in general to believe that NATO was operational, and they still argue it is operational. But our US policy now says, well, actually, under certain circumstances, Europe might be on its own. And we disagree with the policy of Europe. Now, why is this relevant in terms of the Middle East? It's relevant because the US says that Europe ought to engage and help the United States and Israel in the Middle East and provide various kinds of supports. And the Europeans say, no, Article 51 has not been evoked. The US was not attacked, and we actually want to have as little to do with what's going on in the Middle East as possible, and we have no obligation. And that, of course, angers the Trump administration a lot. But Europe says, this is not a NATO situation, and we're not obliged to help out, which of course then leads the Trump administration says, well, we actually don't really think all that well of NATO, and we may not always come to NATO's defense if a country gets involved. So we have the history of Greenland in this situation we've talked about before. We have a situation that is ongoing in the Ukraine, and Ukraine is not a member of NATO, of course, but NATO countries see Ukraine as important for the European situation. Potentially, if Russia conquers Ukraine, and then they'll move on to the Balkans, etc. So the Europeans now have different goals and different priorities than the United States, which gets the United States quite mad because we should get ourselves involved in the Middle East in one way or the other. The other thing, and this is a bit scattered talk today, the other thing is that from an American perspective, we have very often, I don't mean we, everybody listening, but Americans in general, not necessarily a realistic sense of Iran. Iran is a country of 90 plus million people. It is a large country. It is a powerful country. It is a country with a long history. It is a country that has a sense of identity about being Iranian. And I belabor this point only to say that it seems to be coming as a surprise to the United States and Congress and the administration that the people who oppose the authoritarian regime in Iran, that is to say the Iranians who oppose Iranian regimes, are necessarily out there demonstrating in the streets and getting themselves shot by their own authoritarian government. But even if the authoritarian government weren't going to shoot people out there, but the Iranians actually now have a sort of sense of nationalistic sense, so that the opposition in Iran right now is, treading water carefully and saying that, they're doing, they, meaning the United States and Israel, are killing. I think we've killed about 1,000 Iranians so far in this conflict, probably more. We've knocked out the leadership. The opposition in Iran was not in favor of the Iranian leadership, but now they're finding their Iranian identity, and they're being quite quiet because they're saying, Israel and the United States are attacking civilians. They're attacking some landmarks. Even the Iranian opposition values the old and historical buildings that we're destroying. So what we have managed to achieve is to get the political opposition in Iran right now to not demonstrate in favor of Iran's regime being brought down, but being quiet and, in a sense, saying, our identity here is at risk, and our history and our civilians and so on are being attacked from the outside. So they may not be very supportive of the regime, but they're certainly not rising up. Now, I'm making a big point of this because one of the things the U.S. is assuming that any moment now, the Iranian opposition will support any kind of increased invasion by the United States and will be totally critical of the bombings and of the regime and the killing of the leadership. It's interesting to note that the leadership in Iran are people that the opposition to the authoritarian government in Iran continues to oppose, but they're being quiet nowadays, not in supporting them so much, but in not giving in to the idea that Trump is putting out there, that, as soon as, Israel and the United States comes to liberate Iran from its regime, everybody will rise in support of the United States and Israel. And nothing of the sort. People who are very opposed to the Iranian regime are now being very quiet and are increasingly also manifesting their, emotional and intellectual opposition to what Israel and the United States is doing to their country and to their people. And I think there isn't enough of an appreciation of that. That is to say, a sense of nationalism is, if it isn't out there very much in public, is kind of emerging, a kind of a glue of, we're not just getting attacked in terms of the regime that we disagree with as well, but our our people are getting attacked, civilians are getting attacked, historical buildings are getting attacked, children are getting killed. So if the administration thinks that, we're going to produce a big liberation out there if we continue to pursue the situation, they're absolutely wrong. And the next step, of course, that has been threatened by Israel in the Trump administration has been to say, well, folks, eventually we're going to, make sure that we bomb your utility infrastructure. So far, that hasn't been the dominant focus. We will, do harm to your water supply. By the way, Iran already has a water supply issue due to drought and access to safe drinking water and the rest. None of this is going down well in Iran. So I think that is not receiving adequate attention. The other thing that I just want to highlight is that we are in the throes, or at least we claim to be in the throes, to send land forces to the island that is off um, the the area where the tankers come down, and Persian Gulf, etc. And it's not just that small passageways. It's the fact that there is, water above there. You see, if you look at a map, you can see there's the Gulf, and then you eventually get to the point that is now uh, in contention because it's not allowing to let the big tankers through. But the island that we're now Kirk Island, that we're now claiming to attack, or we might attack, or we might send land troops, is, it sounds on American TV, well, it's a little island, and surely we can bomb it, and we can, send American troops to inhabit it. That's where all the oil leaves from, more or less, from Iran. And B, if U.S. troops actually land there and take over there, they will be dead ducks. We will see large attacks against American troops. American soldiers are going to lose their lives. And to absolutely no end, because Iran will be able to attack from the other side and lobby drones and missiles and all the rest onto the island. The other consideration is that the oil that flows down and is the tankers that are now, having difficulty going down, are mostly going to supply Asia. And we have now created a situation where the Asian countries that are used to getting Iranian oil, and through the tankers that come down through Hormuz, they go off to Asia. Now, some Asian countries, including a country like India, for example, is getting resupplied by Russia. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But on the other hand, a country like the Philippines is now at its knees, so to speak. They have no access. They have no access to oil, and so they're, the workday has been cut, electricity has been cut. There are serious problems in the Philippines. While, let's say, India and some other countries in Asia are able to procure oil now from Russia, which of course leads to the next point, which you're aware of if you watch TV news, namely, we had sanctions on Russian oil. And now we have lifted the sanctions. So the countries in Asia that are supplied by Russian oil can now get it again. Well, this is very nice for those countries who will have access to Russian oil. But it is even nicer for Russia because they will now get the income that they were lacking from the sanctions, and they can use that income to make life more difficult in the Ukraine. Because fortunately or unfortunately, the Russians were down to their knees in many ways economically in terms of the cost of the conflict in Ukraine. So now you get into a situation where the Russians will now have the resources to step up in Ukraine and also to help their own economies. Then on top of it all, you have Ukraine. Now, why does Ukraine relate to all this Iranian stuff? You might have noticed on the news that Zelensky has taken a trip to visit the Gulf states and to help the Gulf states with drones. Now, look at how crazy this world is, right? Here is Ukraine, which badly needs help, military help, and financing to keep the Russians at bay. The US has stopped financing Ukraine directly and says this is now Europeans' problem. But in the meantime, Ukraine has developed high levels of technology in manufacturing of drones, which it itself manufactures. And now you get Zelensky telling the Gulf states, hey guys, if you need some more drones, we can help and supply you. So what looks like, on the one hand, you have Ukraine. On the other hand, you have the Iranian and Israeli situation. On the other hand, you still have a sort of internationalization of some aspects of this. Now, if I can be even more confusing and make things even more difficult, is that you now have Yemen involved, and Yemen was an ally, or is an ally of Iran. Okay, but getting Yemen involved has implications for Israel, has implications for the Middle East situation, has to divert attention of Israel onto Yemen. So you now have, one of the countries in the area which was not directly involved in this Middle East crisis, getting involved. On top of that, we are allied and, in bed with Israel. And of course, as soon as you say something derogatory about Israel, you're accused of anti-Semitism. But let me remind folks that being discriminatory against the religion is not the same as being critical of the state policy of a country where it happens to be that 80% of the population is Jewish of Israel. But the issue with Israel's role in the Middle East has nothing to do with that. It is, in fact, a state with state policies. Many Israelis themselves disapprove of what Israel is doing in the Middle East. And in the meantime, on top of everything else, Israel has now invaded and is bombing Lebanon. So you now have Israel, you now have the Gulf states, you now have Yemen, you now have Israel involved with the conflict in Lebanon. And in Lebanon, it is, moving and has belted off, has siphoned off the bottom of Lebanon, which says that's where, the enemy lurks. That's where Hezbollah is. 1 million Lebanese have been displaced, many now living in tents. 1,000 Lebanese or more have so far been killed. And Israel is now saying that some of the land that it is now occupying in the southern part of Lebanon, it will then continue to occupy and annex. This is a nightmare. This is an utter nightmare. And what is forgotten in all of this is the Gazans. The Gazans still, 80% of Gaza is still destroyed. Most of the Gazans still lives in tents. They still don't have enough water. They still don't have enough food, and they're getting very little attention. So the entire Middle East has, in a sense, moved into disarray and has been blown up. How much Israel in the United States policy is still 100% aligned isn't clear, but there obviously are beginning to be some schisms between what Israel wants, and Israel, for example, is, even though the US says it's a negotiation and it's, not targeting certain things at the moment in Iran, Israel is targeting it nevertheless. And so now you get some beginnings of a schism between the policies of Trump and the policies of Netanyahu. So what has happened in the world is that the apple cart has been overthrown, not just throughout the Middle East, but in also parts of the rest of the world. It will take years to recuperate from all of this. Maybe, the consequences in the United States will be manifest in the elections of one kind or another, and in the high gas prices, and so on. On the other hand, the apple cart's overthrow in the Middle East will take years, decades, to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. It is a major crisis, and it is a major crisis for which Israel and the United States are responsible, or our government is responsible for its willingness to ally with Israel in its right-wing government's foolish unwillingness to live with governments and moderate its relationships with various countries. Yes, of course, Israel has been attacked and Israel has to safeguard itself. But the current government of Israel is, while this is all going on, the settlers in the West Bank are busy ousting village after village of Palestinians. And they're doing it with the support of the Israeli military. So by the time, while we're all focused on Iran and so forth, by the time this all gets over, the Israeli government will have moved into three fronts. One, the Iranian one, another one, the Gaza one, and now the Lebanon one, and maybe fourth, I should actually say, the West Bank. By the time this is all over, hopefully it will be over in terms of actual military activity. The West, there will be no two-state solution possible because Gaza is in total disarray, and Israel essentially, the settlers will essentially have taken over the West Bank. So this is a very sad tale, and I'm sorry that I've been sort of all over the place, but there's so many moving parts here that it's worthwhile to bear them in mind, and to say that in spite of the various instabilities and authoritarian governments here, there, and yonder, the fact that we are in this mess right now, we meaning collectively humanity, and the United States, is really in most ways the doing of a foolhardy American administration who decided that the US can do anything. Trump says, he has the authority to do anything. And as Americans wake up to the disasters that are happening in the world and the alienation of so many people in the world now against the United States. It was one thing to say the post-World War period was over after 80 years. It's another thing to say that for all practical purposes, the US influence in the world and the admiration that anybody might have ever had for our country is essentially gone, and probably gone for many, many years. And so in some senses, the Trump administration seems to kind of sense that, our attention needs to be focused in on other things. And of course, it's trying very hard to focus American attention on Cuba, which, we are now going to get ourselves involved in, hopefully not militarily, but some degree of American takeover and increased influence in Cuba is on the agenda. So the newspapers will stop running as many stories, front page and otherwise, on the Middle East. It's the idea, and we can focus in on Cuba, which has a different political constituency in the United States, and also is a more doable project for the United States. Let me end by where I started. We still may have the power, meaning hard power, military power, that the US asserts. What we no longer have is the influence which we used to have in world affairs. And it's going to be very, very difficult to get the influence back. By that I mean influence without having to use hard power to get others to do our bidding. I think for us Americans who are pro-Trump administration or anti-Trump administration, it is already going to be a very difficult reckoning that we are not only a different country internally because of our internal politics, but the world will now sees us as a very different country, and us coming to terms with that the America and our influence in the world was something Americans welcomed even through different administration has essentially been eroded and will in many ways be gone. Sorry to be so scattered today, but all of these things are becoming interlinked intellectually and practically. See you in 2 weeks.